A warm welcome to all of you to this year's last seminar on forced migration in our series. Our series will definitely continue, but we are closing 2021 with Paolo Novak's talk. My name is Aisha Chalar. I'm a professor at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at University of Vienna, and I'm a permanent fellow at IWM, Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Our team is Clemens Schmidt, technical assistant, and Anna Tukovic, a PhD student in anthropology, who is the coordinator of the seminar series hosted by the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at University of Vienna. Before welcoming Professor Paolo Novak from SOAS at University of London, who will be giving the talk titled The Post-Coloniality of Asylum Infrastructure, please allow me to give some information about our seminar series. The seminar series on forced migration is part of Europe-Asia Research Platform on Forced Migration, which is anchored at the Institute für die Wissenschaften für Menschen, Institute for Human Sciences, IWM, and Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group. And the seminar series is hosted, as I said, at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at University of Vienna, of course, in collaboration with these institutions, IWM and CRG, who are the hosts of the research platform. Europe-Asia Research Platform on Forced Migration aims to advance the cooperation between European and South Asian institutions and academics while working towards creating a joint research platform for innovative knowledge production on forced migration and bordering regimes. Bringing together scholars, policymakers, practitioners from different disciplines and regions, the seminar series aspires to decentering scholarship, debates, and policies on forced migration. So we aim to do several levels of decentering. Let me use this occasion also to draw your attention to the current opportunities and calls at the Europe-Asia Research Platform on Forced Migration, calls for fellowships, for participation to certain events. These are journalism fellowship on forced migration. The other one is 2 days teachers workshop on migration and forced migration studies. And the third one is a 5-day ethics of solidarity, care and protection camp. That camp will be taking place in Darjeeling. The deadline for these applications is on December 19th, and you can find out more by following the link in that chat. So the link is there. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to remind you that the seminar is being recorded and we will have a question and answers period after the presentation. Please feel free to pose your questions in the chat throughout the presentation and we will read them afterwards. Pose your questions to Paolo Novak after the presentation. There might be some changes in the order. Sometimes we put certain questions together that go along together with each other. Paolo Novak is a senior lecturer at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University of London. He holds degrees in business and international finance from Bocconi, Milan, and development studies from SOAS. Before joining the faculty at SOAS, Paolo has worked for brokerage firms, investment banks, NGOs, and UNHRC. His research is concerned with the conceptual and contextual relation between borders, migration, and development, and focuses on the contested geographies produced by such relations and on processes of legal and institutional change associated to it, such as refugee law, refugee regime, asylum reception systems, and humanitarianism. Paolo has conducted field research in Peshawar, Pakistan, Makarata, Italy, Meghalaya, India, Cairo, Egypt. So you see that the range of the field work, that the experience, the expertise is quite geographically very wide also. His current research project is titled Asylum Seekers Reception, Taxonomies, and Location. Among many articles and publications, I will just name the most recent ones, and the most recent one actually which came out this year is Deservingness and Uneven Geographies of Asylum Accommodation, published in Social Policy and Society. He has also published widely on neoliberalism and asylum, border and development, NGOization, border regimes in journals such as Critical Sociology, Geopolitics, Political Geography, Journal of Refugee Studies, and many others. I will not continue giving the certain titles in terms of the chapters, in terms of the collaborations in the book projects and the book projects, but I would like to give the floor, instead of enumerating this long list, I would like to give the floor to Paolo Novak for his talk. And thank you, Paolo, for joining us and for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours. We're very happy to have you for our seminar series. Welcome.
Thank you, Aisha. Thanks so much. Thanks for the generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation, very much so. Thank you and Anna for the organization, and Clemens as well. And perhaps most importantly, thanks to the audience, to all of you here. I can see only a few names, but thanks to all of you for deciding to spend some time listening to me in what is usually one of the busiest periods for everyone. So thanks so much. I haven't been able to attend all the seminar series precisely because it's been quite busy and the timing is not really fitting into my schedules currently. But I've been following or trying to catch up with the various recordings, and I mean, I'm even more honored and thankful for the invitation because it's been a stellar lineup. And it's been a great seminar series. I really learned quite a lot from all the speakers. I knew most of their work, but really it kind of came together as a conversation. So I decided to kind of attempt from a limited perspective to add to this conversation by kind of setting what I thought or perceived as the themes of the seminar series with my by now kind of ending research on asylum seekers reception centers, on asylum infrastructure. So trying to set in conversation some of the themes explored by the previous speakers with my field research in Macerata province, a small Italian, central Italian province, where since 2017, I've been spending quite a few months, maybe now I'm ticking up to 8 or 9 months, taking advantage of various research leave periods and so on. So what I've been doing in those summers, long summers, and in that period, ultimately was an institutional ethnography of asylum seekers reception centers. So in a nutshell, I mean, these, for those of you who are familiar with the Italian context, these are called CAS, Extraordinary Reception Centers, which was a peculiar typology of reception centers set up by the Italian government in 2015 by now kind of moribund typology, in the sense that successive laws have attempted to reshape it and change and in fact diminish its humanitarian content in various ways. But basically at the height of the migration crisis, these were the places where the overwhelming majority, up to 87% or so of asylum seekers intercepted in search and rescue zones in the Mediterranean, for example, or on the eastern border of Italy, would be warehoused effectively until their asylum claims would be processed by, let's say, the Italian government. There was a specific administrative body who was assessing their asylum claims. That would involve up to 3 years permanence in these reception centers. So at its broadest, the research was concerned with studying or thinking about the European migration crisis and the EU border at large from its margins. And obviously the location or that definition related to the long-standing trope within border studies about centers and margins and the different ways in which this has been conceived by borderland literatures, by more recent contributions. I won't get into that, but for the purposes of this presentation, I will try to define margins in two ways. So I was trying to study the European migration crisis from a very marginal locations. And this photo was my attempt to represent the Macerata province as, to the eyes of people like me, a very tranquil and pleasant province. Not to say that this was the same experience by those warehoused in those asylum reception centers, but certainly a place where it was not that bad to be an asylum seekers. Certainly not one of those places with extremely large reception centers where up to 300 people in quasi-detention facilities were warehoused, a place where at most, at the height of the crisis, maybe there were no more than 1,000 asylum seekers. So about 1% of the total population dispersed across the whole province. There were, I think, no more than a couple of dozen undocumented migrants. There were no squats. There were no violent clashes between activists, migrants, and the police. I mean, it was a good place, again, quote unquote, from which to gaze at the European migration crisis that I thought, and I think in a sense, I felt that this was the case, it allowed me to look at the European migration crisis in one of its most benevolent places, in a place where the EU regime worked at its best, at least according to what it aims to do at its best, right? And indeed, the second way in which I want to think about margins here is by, or that research in general was to think about the EU border regime, not so much in its violent expression, militarized surveillance, pushbacks, and so on, but again, in its compassionate, quote unquote, side, by looking at places where the humanitarian functions of the border would take place, okay? And hence my concern with these reception centers and with the asylum infrastructure, as I will talk about it today. So what I want to do in the next, I think no more than 40 minutes, is to speak about these stars, the stars that you see in this map, which correspond to the various locations where these reception centers stood in 2017. There were 65 such centers. You only see about 25 or so. The overwhelming majority, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but were in the capital, provincial capital in Macerata. That would be around 45%, 45 out of 65, and yet they only had like 10% occupancy. These were all fairly large centers. The one over here with 100, occupants, the one over here with about 50, this cluster of 4 that I will talk about a bit later, had a total of 80, again, 80 to 100 asylum seekers and so on. And I want to begin conceiving these stars as nodes of the EU border regime, drawing from literature concerned with the logistification of asylum management. But I want to complicate this conceptualization by progressively unraveling various geographies and various temporalities that define the social life of these buildings beyond their functions as asylum infrastructure. And I want to suggest that these geographies and temporalities, ultimately these social relations, exceed the border-migrant dialectic that constitute them as asylum infrastructure, and yet are fundamental to understand the conditions that explain the emergence and reproduction of the border in its concrete manifestations. So the stars that you see here, the main point of this all will be, is that they're not just a node of the EU border regime, but rather they are an entanglement, a coming together of trajectories of all sorts, ultimately inspired by feminist and post-colonial critiques of Marxian and autonomist conceptualizations of space. I want to draw from the work of Doreen Massey and Milton Santos to think about these stars as moments in the immense movement of the world, or to use Doreen Massey's formulation, as temporary time-space constellations. And the starting point for all of this, as I said, is literature on the EU border regime, and particularly on the logistification and reorganization of border regimes along logistical lines. So in a nutshell, and again, I won't be discussing much of here for reason of time, but the argument, as I understand it, of this literature is that much like in relation to the supply chain imperatives that inform business logistics, and that people like Deborah Cowen and Lale Khalili have extensively spoke about, the concern with securitizing circulation, migrant circulation, has produced new geographies of governance that displace borders and that actively reorganize the inside and outside of space. In a sense, this is a peculiar take on the externalization literature, one that attempts to recast the geographies created by these forms of governance, not so much in terms of processes of violence exclusion, but rather as processes that channel, that tame and contain migrants' autonomous mobilities. So people like Sandra Mezzadra, Martina Tazzioli, or Alten Reed and the others who you see cited here, assert that a logistical gaze on EU border management is concerned with identifying the processes that channel these turbulent, unpredictable, and autonomous movements through governmentalized routes meant to enable processes of filtering and selection. And the multiplication of hotspots, detention centers, channels of circulation, networks of surveillance are ultimately empirical confirmations of that logistical reorganization of, in this case, the EU border regime. And I start from this literature because I find it extremely insightful for conceiving the stars that you see at the top left of these slides in at least two respects. The first one, because I am able through this literature to connect those stars, if you wish, but more in general, disparate management policies and practices across the world. I mean, here it's Africa only, but I mean, they extend as far as Afghanistan for sure. And to think about how all of these places, policies, practices are ultimately connected, or they're ultimately part of the same governmental strategy for the management of border crossing. So from this perspective, the reception centers, those stars, are not just humanitarian shelters, as some literature portrays them, where the Italian government warehouses migrants, but they're part of a broader geography of migration controls that spans across continents. So they're deeply connected with European hotspots, Libyan detention centers, refugee camps in Turkey and Lebanon. They are the benevolent side of the coin, that on its flip side, boasts militarized surveillance and patrolling, provides funding to militias like the Janjaweed or to authoritarian populist leaders like Erdogan, or indeed that abandons Afghans after having created the conditions for their lack of protection. So these stars, these reception centers are one location, one node, if you wish, of the EU border zone, a node that is inseparable from others. They are, despite being the benevolent and compassionate and humanitarian side of it, they are part and parcel of the violence expressed by the EU border in the Mediterranean, in the Balkans, or indeed at the Polish-Belarus borders. Care and control cannot be separated, but are co-constitutive of these centers. The second reason why I think this literature is quite insightful from my perspective, or for thinking about these centers, is that it powerfully accounts for migrant subjectivities and for their autonomy. So the asylum seekers that I met and I encountered and I spoke to and I spent time with in Macerata, from this perspective, are not just migrants with diverse desires and aspirations, or migrants who enact everyday forms of resistance, or who may tactically wait in those places until they find the opportunity to continue their journey north to France or to Germany, or who seek documents and jobs. Although they all are, in a sense, like as Vicky Squire suggests, and as I will return to later. But through this literature, I can conceive them as collective political subjectivities that constitute a social movement, and their struggles being the engine of transformation for this logistical reorganization. It is their turbulence and the uncontainability, if you wish, of their movement that has prompted the EU border regime to be reorganized along logistical lines and the creation of channels. So to restate this, I mean, I think this productive conceptualization of the humanitarian border is at the heart of my understanding of reception centers in Macerata, and a productive understanding that refers both to this governmental strategy as producing new geographies and as being produced by migrant struggles. However, and this is when I kind of begin to complicate this representation, I find that limiting my analysis to the concern with the government of border crossing and the management of autonomous mobilities, or to what the Genova calls the dialectic between bordering tactics and autonomous mobilities, may be too narrow an analytical lens for capturing what these reception centers, these stars are, for conceptualizing them in their totality, if you wish. Primarily because it offers me little opportunities for capturing their unevenness, their differences, while being part of the same violent border regime. Being accommodated there in Macerata, as I said at the beginning, is not exactly the same as being in a Libyan detention center, or indeed at the Polish-Belarus border, or indeed, as I will try to sketch later on in the presentation, is not the same as being in the same type of reception centers in other parts of Italy. In fact, one of the key things that emerged from my field research is that each one of these stars was quite unique, and was quite unique as a manifestation of their function of asylum's infrastructure. So the way in which care and control were combined in each of these reception centers, and the kind of subjectivities that were engendered by being accommodated in one or the other of these stars were quite different. And I think this literature does not offer me too many tools for capturing such difference. So to uncover and appreciate this unevenness, I think we need to dig deeper into the social ontology of the border and of asylum infrastructure. And I think we need to study it in place. And I try to do so in 3 steps in what remains of my talk. The first step is to think about these reception centers as concrete place-specific manifestations of the EU border regime, okay? So, as I said, I mean, for sure, the EU border connected, I mean, now Macerata has very few asylum seekers, but certainly connected Macerata to the Mediterranean and Balkan routes, for example, through its logistical mechanisms, and the asylum seekers that it accommodated connected that same province to remote valleys, or not so remote perhaps nowadays, along the Afghan-Pakistani border, with villages in Delta State, Nigeria, or indeed with neighborhoods in Rangpur, Bangladesh, and or Serekunda in the Gambia. And through these connections, the EU border profoundly transformed Macerata, right? For sure. I mean, there would be no queues on Thursday morning outside the immigration office of the decentralized office of the police, the Questura that you see in this image. There would be no jobs for so-called cultural mediators like this woman here, and all those who worked as Italian teachers, as para-lawyers, as cultural mediators, quote unquote, in the various reception centers established in the province. In fact, in 2017, the local university opened a new master in cultural interpretation, quote unquote. And all of these things would have not happened. But beyond that, there would have not been a proliferation of shops selling SIM cards or providing remittances services, formal and informal one. The local supermarkets would have not started to sell quote unquote exotic spices or spices that were never seen in such a province. So decisively, there is a connection established by the EU border, and one that transforms places like Macerata into globalized, effectively, nodes of the EU border. But this transformation is not unidirectional. Actually, it works both ways. The border is also transformed by the social dynamics that were present or are present in Macerata at large. And I want to give you just one example before I continue. These 3 organizations that you see at the bottom, Axim, Goose, and the Red Cross, were 3 out of only 6 subcontractors of the Italian government in charge of managing asylum seekers and asylum infrastructure. And they would be part of the wide range of humanitarian agents, according to this literature, that participated in the process of border work, like Polly Pallister Wilkins has called it, that render the EU border concrete. They didn't, in fact, in Macerata, but in other places, they were part and parcel of contestations or reappropriations or deflections of the ways in which the EU border concretely operates in its place-specific manifestations. But this literature, at best, understands these different positionings, these deflections, by reference to their diverse discursive framings. I'm thinking here about the article by Maurice Thierle on humanitarianism in the Mediterranean. If you observe them in place, then again, you see that they're not really just humanitarian agents, but they're part and parcel of the social fabric. Each of these 3 and the 3 others that I could not contain on this slide, they're not just humanitarian agents, they're part of the social fabric of Macerata. Think about, for example, how they secured buildings to be used as asylum infrastructure. A church-based cooperative, one of the 6, well, actually used housing facilities that were donated to the dioceses by various benefactors over the last 3 or 4 decades. The president of the largest NGO, Goose, was instead deeply connected with local elites and the main political party in government in the region, and indeed at that time in the central government. And for him, finding accommodation or finding buildings to be used as asylum infrastructure was really about mobilizing his own networks. Another NGO, I should maybe not mention, but basically this one, accommodated asylum seekers in rural houses that belonged to a trust, which effectively was a cover for an aristocratic family and some other church interests, of which the president of that NGO was also part of the board of trustees of that same trust managing the estate. So my point is that subcontractors, landlords, their connections with local governments, their ownership of land or apartments, their political inclinations, of those that render concrete the EU border, make them not just humanitarian agents, but rather societal agents whose relationships amongst them, between them and state and market, become entangled with the humanitarian border, transforming it in its wake, right? So I'm drawing ultimately here from classical civil society literature in development studies to think about civil society agents, not just as an expression of a border regime at large, but really as part and parcel of the social fabric and social terrain that gives them their emergence. And I want to take this point further, and specifically in relation to asylum infrastructure, by conceiving this place-specific manifestation as a productive relation. So literature on the EU border and on the logistification of asylum traditionally draws from the Foucauldian toolbox. And it is in this toolbox that inspires the conceptualization of the border as inherently productive. Productive in a disciplinary sense, in the sense of producing realities, knowledges, new geographies of governance, if you wish, new categorization, new knowledges, but productive also in the sense of it being constituted by and constitutive of migrant, in this case, struggles. What I'm trying to suggest with the expression productive relation is that if we observe the concrete manifestations of borders, of the EU border in place, a third productive axis or dimension emerges. The productive relation between the border and what Irene Peano in a recent article calls, very appropriately, I think, stratified landscapes defined over centuries by interventions on land, property, and people. Those stratified landscapes that transform the humanitarian border as they are being transformed by it. And I think you can think, and I will try in the limited possible time to sketch this point by reference to each of the buildings used as asylum infrastructure, because each of them is a repository of histories and stories that testify to that rich social terrain and to the rich fabric of resistances that provide the condition for the border to emerge in Macerata in the first place. Take, for example, the estate at the bottom of this slide. I mean, this is an old photo, well, it's my photo of an old photo from the 1960s, 70s that is displayed in the restaurant that you see at the back here of this large estate. This was a place that it was that cluster of 4 centers that in 2017 accommodated between 80 and 100 asylum seekers in 4 accommodation units, and a place that I visited many times, I think over 100 or so. So the the estate is owned by the same family since the 15th century, when the one member of the family from the families from Tuscany moved to this part of Italy. This is on the Adriatic coast, to buy, I think, a couple of 100 hectares of land to establish a hunting ground for them. But that was later transformed into an agricultural estate when all of this part of Italy was under the Pope, under the Papal States, which were effectively the ruling sovereign across central Italy until 1870. So the family's deep connections with the Pope meant that in 1820, they were given the title of Marquis, becoming one of the many aristocratic families in the area, the same aristocratic families that make up today's social landscape, even if their aristocratic title does not mean anything in law. For sure, it means still quite a lot in terms of land ownership patterns. After the so-called reunification of Italy, the family fortunes were by no means dented by the establishment of the newly proclaimed Kingdom of Italy. In fact, one of the family members became a senator, and the family was able to expand the estate by buying for cheap land from the Kingdom of Italy, land that was or that had been confiscated from the church. The estate grew through the fascist period. Outside the restaurant, there is a wall, and in that wall, there is a little plaque saying, this wall was built when the Italians conquered Italy, which reminds me of Camilla Hawthorne's challenge to the notion of Italiani brava gente, Italians good people. Indeed, the current owner, now deceased, I think I was one of the last ones to interview him, was a self-proclaimed fascist. But during the fascist period, it was when the housing units that were used to accommodate, when the housing units, the pigsty and the stable were expanded and constructed. And these housing units accommodated sharecroppers. I mean, until the 1970s, sharecropping was by far the most traditional contract and way of tilling the land in central Italy, and certainly in this part of central Italy. With the abolishment in law of sharecropping, I mean, the houses became emptied, they were renovated and accommodated migrants from the south of Italy who had attempted or got employment in the newly developed industrial clusters in the region. In the 1990s, the family took advantage of EU regional funds to transform and refurbish this accommodation into self-contained studio flats aimed at the tourist markets, and so on and so forth, until after the 2008 economic crisis, they were emptied, and luck, or the Marquis' luck, would have it that the president of the largest NGO arrived in 2014 and offered the Marquis to rent his housing units for the purposes of accommodating migrants, effectively giving him something like 9,000 euros a month for their accommodation, right? I mean, the story of this family, which I usually, and some of you might have heard it, I usually use in this kind of presentation, is ultimately a story of transformation and a story of Italian state development and state transformation. It's a story of the Gattopardo, if you wish, of an aristocratic family that has been able to shape the form and content of the law, taking advantage of both the form and the content of the law in order to maintain and preserve its own privileges. But other infrastructure speaks of different trajectories within that same history of state development. Giorgio, the owner of this hotel, Hotel Le Grazie, was actually of very humble origin. He was the last of 11 siblings, 8 of which were women. According to his daughter, I mean, this was a problem at the time of sharecropping because none of the aristocratic families would have them tilling their land as sharecroppers until one of the ladies of these aristocratic families decided to take them at the condition that all the women in the family were to work for her and as free slaves, as Giorgio's daughter told me. They all became extremely good cooks, apparently, and one of them became the force of Hotel Le Grazie that you see here, an hotel that again enjoyed a tremendous success in its early years. And I'm cutting short the story because I'm aware of time. Until in the 1990s, the tourist market was increasingly drawn to self-contained studios, such as the one refurbished by the Marquise, and it kind of went into a decline and managed to survive as a business only thanks to the sister in the kitchen producing spectacular meals, and by renting some of its room for annual retreats of a neo-catechumenal church. Until, once again, the president of the largest NGO in 2011 came and asked for no more than 10 rooms to be rented for 15 days, but within the space of a year, began to occupy all the rooms in the hotel year-round. And in fact, gave also to Giorgio a revenue that he then invested into buying another building, which he intended to use as a house for the elderly, that instead became occupied by those displaced by the earthquake of 2017. I could go on, I could talk to you about the Caritas Center in Civitanova, but the point is that each of these 65 reception centers is a repository of histories and stories, and in chronicling very sketchily their afterlives, I wanted to emphasize how the border does not operate on a tabula rasa. Each of these buildings testifies the rich social terrain that provides the conditions for the border to be rendered concrete in places like Macerata, and indeed to be rendered uniquely concrete in each of these places, both in each of these infrastructures and in Macerata, as opposed to places like Milan, Naples, or other smaller provinces. And if the story of each of these buildings evokes a stratified landscape that is broadly defined by processes of Italian state formation and state development, the stories and histories of its current occupants, of the asylum seekers caught in the topological web of the humanitarian border, speak of course, other social terrains and stratified landscape. They transform each of these facilities into a unique articulation of processes, forces, and relations. Take any of the stories of the people accommodated in rooms such as the ones that you see here on the top left. Take the story of Elias. I mean, I don't know, I'm just making up these names, so pronounce it as you wish. A Ghanaian migrant who left his town to go to Libya, searching for a job, when Gaddafi, who appeared on his WhatsApp number as the profile image until last year, when Gaddafi was welcoming migrant workers from all over the continent. He worked in Libya for an Italian man who now lives in Cameroon for 8 years and had to board a dinghy headed towards Italy as a consequence of the military intervention of 2011, an accidental refugee, if you wish, that after 3 years in Italy and after a long journey as an irregularized migrant across Italy, Spain, Switzerland, managed to enter as an asylum seeker, once again, a reception center in Germany. Or consider Innocent, a young man from a village in Delta State, Nigeria, that you see here, one that formally left that village because of a feud between two families or two kings that had been fighting in that village for quite some time, but who ultimately told me that in a place like this, he only had two job opportunities. One was on the rubber plantation to the east of the village, a rubber plantation that was first set up during colonial times by the British, or on the marijuana plantation to the west of the village, I assume more recently set up. In one, he didn't get a job, and in the other, he didn't want to actually go. Again, after 3 years in these reception centers, including in the two that I described above, in Hotel Le Grazie in the Marquise estate, he was actually rendered irregularized as his asylum claim was denied, lived with another person in a squat in Macerata until he was evicted from them, and I have now lost track of him. Or consider Grace, a Nigerian woman with whom Innocent shared the boat journey across the Mediterranean. Contrary to him, who was immediately detained in a first reception center, she was whisked past the reception center and taken to France. And they exchanged message for a month. He actually, Innocent he fell in love for Grace until he realized that she was actually being trafficked and put to work as a sex worker, and became angry and started rambling against all Nigerian women. Or take, excuse me, Alex, a man from the Gambia who as a young teenager is sent to Senegal by his father to work as an apprentice in a patron to learn masonry. And he lives there without a pay for 4 years. He's then sent to Mauritania. He embarks on long journeys, detained in Morocco until he makes it to Italy before the 2011 intervention in Libya, which meant that effectively he was able to get a document very easily, to the point that he became a supervisor in one of the houses of the Marquise, from refugee to supervisor of refugees. Or indeed, in my last trip in 2020, take the stories of the more recently arrived Pakistani and Afghans who had arrived from Kurram Agency, from Malakand, from Kandahar, places and people that spoke about military interventions, brutality. They spoke of brothers and sisters being killed, of drone bombardments and treacherous journeys. So each of the stars that you see here at the bottom is one location, one of the locations that people wanted to share with me that depicts the towns, cities, and villages of people I met in Macerata. And each of these stars speak differently about the border regime. They speak of the ways in which colonial powers have managed territories and populations for centuries. And they speak of contemporary border management practices that, rather than containing and channeling circulation, they attempt to foster it, to enable it, to create infrastructure that facilitate it. Of course, this is the circulation of capital, of transnational elites and invading armies. So together, their stories and the stories of Giorgio, of the Marquise, or I didn't speak about them, of the precarious workers working for the NGOs that I mentioned before, of the sharecroppers and the other Italian migrant workers that lived in these buildings before them, all together, they transform asylum infrastructure, each of these stars in Macerata, into a moment of the immense movement of the world. I will draw to a conclusion. I think I'm just about managing within time. So, in a sense, I began this presentation by building upon literature concerned with the logistification of the EU humanitarian border, and I framed my understanding of reception center in Macerata as nodes of the diffuse governmental geographies produced by the EU border for the management of border crossings, and produced by the collective subjectivities of migrants whose autonomous mobilities the border attempts to channel, to tame, and to contain. But I try to complicate this understanding of reception centers as nodes of the border by thinking ethnographically about their concrete manifestations. I expose the ways in which these concrete manifestations of the border is transformed. In this concrete manifestation, the border is transformed by the social forces and dynamics of the places it transforms into its logistical nodes. And I push further the argument by describing these transformations in terms of a productive relation between between the border itself and the rich social terrain which the border intervenes upon and articulates with. In place, through this productive relation, the border becomes responsive to and is constituted by forces and relations that exceed the border-migrant dialectic, that articulate with it, and that shape its actual, contingent, and contextual unfolding. And I think this is a crucial point, because this is how the border really manages not only to be rendered concrete, but to reproduce in itself across society. If you wish to spread like a cancer, taking advantage and reproducing various set of inequalities. It is in this mundane social terrain that the border reproduces itself beyond the border-migrant dialectic. And at its broadest, or more broadly, the presentation also wanted to think about asylum infrastructure as a way of speaking about borders. Perhaps too ambitious terms, I could say that I wanted to think about this as asylum infrastructure as a locus of enunciation, where individuals and collective expressions mingle, to use Gloria Anzaldua's word. A locus of enunciation that is place-specific and embodied. And the expression of post-coloniality of infrastructure sketches this logic as one that never abandons the significance of the coloniality of asylum, of migration, of infrastructure, of borders, in the way in which many have talked about it. Fiorenza Picozza talks about, drawing from the autonomist tradition, describes in her book about talking about the coloniality of asylum and the various knowledges that are reproduced through it, the legal, political, and social processes that reproduce the coloniality of asylum. Or indeed, the way in which a few weeks ago, Prem talked about the coloniality of migration and its deep relation with imperialist political economy and the production of surplus population. Or indeed, the way in which, more recently, many have talked about the coloniality of infrastructure as reproducing colonial relations of power and as being entangled with colonial ways of doing, knowing, and being. But never abandoning these concerns, I have tried to, in a sense, further decenter, if that objective is to decenter the border migrant dialectic by bringing us back to its colonial roots, I wanted to further decenter the decolonial imperative, if you wish, by trying to put together word-making practices with place-making projects, very situated, very embodied. And it is at that intersection, I think, that the expression time-space constellation, as Doreen Massey calls it, really comes to the fore. And ultimately, I wanted to offer an ontology of asylum infrastructure of the border in itself that is unfixed, contexted, and multiple, because I think that is not only analytically insightful in relation to the conditions that provide the possibility for the border to reproduce itself, but also because it allows us, I think, to think about politics in ways that are very place-specific. And I'll leave it here. I think I went over time, so I'll leave it here for the moment.
Thank you very much, Paolo. It doesn't matter you went over time. It was a pleasure to listen. And actually, I'm so happy that we have such a strong position and framing, actually reframing of the framings that we had all through the year. So it is not only a kind of a full stop, it opens a completely a different kind of a pathway for studying not only reception centers. It is much more than that, what the border does, what the coloniality and post-coloniality do in terms of function, in terms of those producing and reproducing social inequalities. And definitely, I think we are thankful to you to show that thinking about just the border as cheapening the labor, it doesn't do. It doesn't do to capture
to an extent.
it's just one part of it. It doesn't do justice to actually what the borders do in terms of the as productive power, as productive constellations, and in a way the assemblages and the way that you showed it in the notes. So I think this is very very interesting, that the way that you put it in a very powerful way. Every time that I hear about the ethnographic material of this Macerata, I'm amazed that how populated this so tranquil looking, so empty looking, disconnected looking place, and how connected it is in a multiscalar way. And what I find it very important that I think to underline is that, I mean, I think you are preaching to us, all the converted ones, in the sense that place matters. Place really matters, and then looking at the simply as the externalizations of the borders is not enough to capture actually what is behind, and or that it is not also, not only the externalization is enough to capture the complexity, but also kind of a generic statement of bordering tactics and autonomous mobility. It becomes, it again falls short to capture how the spatial differences, how those spaces unfold in terms of functioning, the way that the border produces and reproduces inequalities, and then the unevenness of the spatial unevenness. And I think that what I found it very important is that, so it is on the board, on the reception centers, but it is an explosive what you're throwing into. You're just throwing in a bomb there to several fronts in terms of theoretical fronts. And I think the challenge is ours to pick it up. And then what I found also very interesting is that once you look at it in a relational way to those nodes, and then if you frame it in a relational way, that the tranquility becomes part of a very violent global structure, global frame. And if I have to translate it to my own language in terms of, it is a very populated multiscalar social field by the NGOs, by the subcontractors, landlords, but also it becomes a very important lens to analyze, to understand the transformations of state in Italy. So there is not only theoretical bombs, but there are also methodological, very important points in it. I have one question in terms of, if I understand you in terms of the productive power as a productive force, that the borders on land, property, and people, and creating new geographies of governance, and connectedly mutually constitutive of those subjectivities also. So that is, it is going into the fabric. But you show that you came to this kind of the coloniality. And then the title was the post-coloniality, I think, or the post-colonial. As I understood, is that it is not simply operating Or am I understanding correctly? And where would this take us to? That what you're showing is not, when you say that the border does not operate on a tabula rasa, but tabula rasa is not in the sense of kind of the legacies. They have a social life. That is, you show that there is a very, very active, whereas there is a kind of the processes, dynamics continue at that place and unfolding, and there is the kind of the cross paths in a way, and then the co-constitutive. But it is not simply a question of legacy, because tabula rasa always taught about that it's a kind of a legacy, that formal legacy. But I see it is more as an kind of an active field. Yeah. That co-constitutive. So it is not simply colonial legacies. I would like to push. Is it simply colonial legacies, or it is a formation of, or transfer, or production, and the reproduction of the coloniality working in those places? So I will stop. I will just ask this question. I already see that there are lots of questions, so I will not take the priority. Okay, let me ask you, there is another question. From Rohini Mitra. Thank you. This was quite fascinating to listen to and also think about in the context of countries where asylum infrastructure is not developed. Rather, encounters with the border and the representatives of the state empowered to impose the border take place in an ad hoc manner, sometimes when least expected. So how generalizable is this? That is for the broader, for other places, I think.
Okay, thank you very much for the comments and for the both very, very good questions. Okay, maybe I'll start with Aisha's comments that, well, the last one especially, maybe I may not have an answer. So in a sense, so I went this way. I mean, the kind of narrative on this presentation and the way in which I've been thinking about this research starts within border studies and starts with the debate about the border. And so takes that trajectory, but really in my own research trajectory starts with the classical debates in development studies, whereby the so-called imposition of development was quite often narrated as a unidirectional imposition, right? Depriving agency of those to be developed, that talked about civil society as an expression of some US imperialist driving logic, that talked about democracy as a plot and a tool for the reproduction of imperial forces, and so on and so forth, which I always find a bit problematic, because in a sense takes away agency from those that are at the receiving end, that are able in various ways to, again, reappropriate, deflect, and engage with these processes. So when I started looking at the European crisis and effectively moving between Marxist understandings of fortress Europe and the cheapening of labor, and autonomist understandings that were mostly concerned with the border-migrant dialectic, I felt there was a lot to be said that remained unsaid. And ultimately, perhaps the background to this it really stems from development studies and for thinking about Macerata at the intersection of three types of combined and uneven development trajectories. One that is obviously the global combined and uneven development that explains, if you wish, migration patterns in its most structural sense, the global south and the global north, and all of that. One that is the combined and uneven process of integration of European peripheries into the EU. And this is where most the institutional level emerges, the Dublin regulation, the no relocation, the peripheral states as effectively the cushions for the EU border regime that prompted the constitution of places like Macerata into nodes of the humanitarian border. But third, also the long process of combined and uneven development of the Italian peninsula, which, as many other states, is a state whereby particularly elites from the north and others engaged in processes of integration. So all of these trajectories converge in a place like Macerata and make it extremely different from other parts of Italy. I mean, again, I mentioned Irene Peano's discussion. She has a beautiful article on how these kind of dynamics, which she looks at through the lens of coloniality of infrastructure, play out in southern Italy, in Apulia, and again talks similarly about fascism and other things. But so I'm all into this. I think about development. I really wanted to bring out those place-making projects. I mean, the interviews with those marquis that really, as a fascist guy that gets the stick from other fascists because he rents to Black people and we shouldn't mix, and he's able to tell you all the minute details about his property and has that sense of history, the stories of the teacher. So they intersect. And I think it is those agencies and subjectivities that are transformed that are as important as those of the migrants. I think that is ultimately what I wanted to bring out. And of course, that reproduces a coloniality. I just used the expression post-coloniality because quite often I feel that some of the decolonial approaches replicate an understanding of the coloniality that does not capture unevenness. But I mean, the two are obviously inseparable from each other. As I mentioned in my last slide, I never abandoned that sense of coloniality of it. And in a sense, maybe I can continue thinking about the generalizability of all of this. And to say that, look, I'm not sure what is meant by, yeah, exactly. I don't know who posted that article by Irene Peano, but that's exactly the article I was referring to. I don't know which context the person asking the question referred to. I mean, again, I went back to my experience in Pakistan, where the settlement, which was not formalized in any way, in the way in which, and I'm not talking about the refugee camps outside Peshawar, Kachagari, and all of these, but I'm thinking about places in Chitral or in what used to be called northern areas when I was there. I mean, they were ultimately dependent on the village shura, the religious affiliation. So they may not be formalized infrastructure, but I think infrastructure has now become a very generalizable a term that have somewhat substituted or incorporated various lines of thinking. So in that sense is generalizable. I mean, there were Afghan refugees across Pakistan, but the way in which they were accommodated or the way in which their duties and rights, however you want to conceive them, were conceived in each specific place, depended really on the social governance structures of the place in which they were located, and quite different. And partly also relates, and I close here, to the ad hoc encounters. Again, I don't know what you're referring to, but I'm thinking, again, my very brief research in Northeast India. And again, those very brief encounters were very much dependent on well, the particular understanding of the various subject positions involved in that encounter. But if you tell me what you had in mind, I might be more precise with my answer. Okay,
thank you very much, Paolo. There are some kinds of, unfortunately, some people had to leave,
Yeah.
and then indicated that they have enjoyed the talk very much, like Georgia Donna or Karin, yes, but Grazia Tona has a question. Thank you, Paola, for this great presentation. Coming from the area, the choice of this province surprised me. On the one hand, and on the other, really catched its somehow hidden but rooted relations of inequality and marginality. About specificity, I'd like to ask how the very character of the place affects migrants' movement, imagined or enacted, in sense of desires, opportunity to stay, move further, escape, or